She was telling me about the Navajo way. You would say, you sing it? And you sing Slim to the Rush? Hello. Right, do that. She's got your number. She does. It's so nice to see you talk. How do you feel? Okie dokie. Where did you see them? Right behind Doc. Right behind Doc. Oh, okay. Look, there's singing. Yeah, yeah. Right there. All right.
Morning, how are you?
Anyway, so you got the weekend?
Good morning. It's time to get started. Glad to have you for this last class of the quarter in the auditorium that we've been looking at the influence of a woman. We have a smaller group today, so hopefully you'll feel comfortable making comments and we can have some more discussion. Discussion's been very good. I appreciate everyone's participation, and hopefully this has been of some benefit. The streaming's going this morning as well, so James will let us know if we have any comments through the YouTube. Okay, so today, this is, as I said, last lesson. This is lesson 13. This will be about Esther. So, of course, our text for today was the book of Esther. And I had selected certain passages, but, I selected bits and pieces of this story. So if you're like me, it's just easier just to read the whole book. It's a very interesting read and doesn't take a lot of time. So what we'll do, as we have been doing in this class, is we'll cover the story quickly. And I'm assuming that y'all have already done the reading, so we'll hit the highlights, kind of just the facts for the story before we go through the worksheet and answer some questions and do some speculation. As you recall, one of the things we want to do in this class is to take a look at how powerful the influence of a woman can be, either for good or for bad. Look at ways where that'll affect us if we're men, to be aware of this influence, and for a woman to be aware of how much influence you actually have, and to look at ways to maximize that for the good. And we also wanted to look at these Bible stories. We focused entirely in the Old Testament, and there's examples of women in the New Testament who are influential. But we've looked at the Old Testament, and as we read these accounts, hopefully we've thought a little bit more about the people involved and how these are actual people who are struggling in their lives. And it's for us, we have short accounts of these stories, but this is real. And they're people who make mistakes, who do well, who do poorly, and have to deal with those consequences. So I hope that as we've done this, these stories have become a little bit more real to you. So this week, we're jumping ahead from the life of David, where we left off in the life of David 2 weeks, or the last 3 weeks. And we jump ahead about 500 years to a time of captivity. Right? Judah was captured by Babylon. Babylon was overthrown by Persia. And so here we are in the Persian kingdom. And so it's been some time has passed. We're going to meet a king named, I'm probably going to say it wrong numerous times, Ahasuerus. And he is the king of Persia. It's a time of prosperity for them. You can tell in the first chapter, the king is giving this feast, and it goes on for how many days? 180 days is how long this feast goes on. So this is extravagance. This is not just time of prosperity and peace. This is extravagance. And as part of this feast, at some point in his pride and in his extravagance, he wants to bring out his Queen Vashti, and display her beauty to his princes, to the men who are gathered there. And she refuses to come. So what was his reaction to this refusal? Laverne? He's going to get a new queen. Okay, yeah, he's very upset. And it's interesting, he doesn't essentially, in the text, he doesn't know initially what to do about this. And so he asked his advisors what they thought. And the advisors, one of them speaks up and suggests that he put Vashti away and get a new queen. And why? Why was it so important to them to discipline Queen Vashti, per the text? Okay, Melanie says they didn't want the other women to do the same thing. Is that what you're going to say, Laverne? Which is interesting, right? This wasn't just an insult to the king, but they thought, well, if she's allowed to disregard her husband, then all the wives in the whole kingdom are going to start ignoring their husbands. And so we have to make an example of Queen Vashti, which is very interesting that the king in all his power and these princes in all their power were so worried about their wives disrespecting them. And they had to take some very, very strong action. Laverne thinks that they were right, that the women were going to see this. Okay? If Vashti was going to ignore her husband, why wouldn't the other women? Okay? Other thoughts? Rob?
He's got a lot of wives, and he only has one queen.
Okay. Has a lot of wives at one queen. Okay.
She has an official capacity.
Yep.
A lot of rules and regulations regarding why they couldn't just come in and talk to him. So he was very much in control.
Yeah, so Rob brings up something that we're going to be talking about this morning, is that there's a lot of regulations. There's a lot of barriers between the women in this culture and the men, especially the king. And the queen didn't always have access. Sandy? Okay, interesting. Sandy thinks perhaps this may have been a pattern for Vashti, and that's quite possible. We don't have a lot of information here either about this relationship other than this one instance. So a lot of people speculate that what he was asking her to do was inappropriate, display beauty in a way that was inappropriate, and so she was justified in refusing. But in any case, there are consequences for Vashti for taking the stand that she took. And so she is going to be replaced. And that brings in the opportunity for the character Esther that we're going to be introduced to now. So who was Esther? What do we know of her background? She was Jewish. Okay. She was an orphan. Right. So she was an orphan, and she's in this foreign land, so to speak, in Persia. Pardon me. So who's raising her then? Cousin Mordecai. Right. So this is obviously an older cousin, because what kind of relationship did they have between these two? It was a really strong father-daughter relationship. And so as we look at Esther's influence, we can't ignore the influence that Mordecai has in this story, because clearly he is her father figure, and that's going to benefit her tremendously. And also that strong bond they have is going to benefit Mordecai as well. Okay, so to replace Queen Vashti, they're going to have essentially a competition, it sounds like. In all the kingdom, all the beautiful women are going to be brought together, and they're going to let the king decide who his favorite is. This is going to be a long, drawn-out process. They have to be in the harem for a year before they're even eligible to go and meet the king. They're taking turns one at a time, one night with the king, and apparently in this process, they get to bring some kind of prop, something with them to take to the king, and they have their night, and then the next day, they're put into the second harem, which is really reserved apparently for the concubines. And then if the king were to call on them by name, they would be called back, but otherwise, that's it. So in this process, what is the advice Mordecai gives to Esther at this point? What's that, Rob? Not to tell her heritage. She's not to tell them that she's a Jew. Why is that? Anybody want to speculate on that? Oh, they were captives. That's true. Yeah, it seems to be that they were second-class citizens. They were not held in regard among the Persians. And that's not surprising, right? That a king would want his queen to be from his shared heritage. Rob?
What's the context? And she's competing.
Okay.
And that's the
Okay. Because it is a contest. Yeah, so some of the other people involved may want to play that against Esther. She's not even really Persian. And so she does follow his advice, and she keeps it to herself. She makes an ally, though, early on in this. Did y'all pick up on that in chapter 2, verse 8? Yeah, it's one of the eunuchs who's in charge of the harem. And Rob, what'd you say? Haggai? I couldn't figure out how to say that name, so we'll go with that. But this official has responsibility over these women. How is it that she wins him over?
I think a lot is the way she carried herself, her natural beauty, and the way she treated everyone, the humility that she gave, that she had at that time, her, the grace that she carried.
Okay. So Antia thinks that her personality, perhaps, is what won him over. Does it say clearly? No. So that's some more speculation, right? Well, is it possible that just because she was beautiful, she got his attention, got his favor? Gus?
Well, as we go through, we cannot rule out this providence of God.
Okay, providence of God being involved.
The way this whole thing plays out seems to be the predominant factor in her behavior, success.
God's providence shown throughout this story. Sure, right. Rob?
She has his advice. She has his advice. So my guess is part of it, humility, perfection.
Okay. So Rob points out, and I wonder if Julie said something a second ago, and I'll get back to Rob, but Julie said it couldn't have just been just her beauty because these are the most beautiful women in the kingdom, and they're all around. They're all beautiful. So it seems to me that that's probably right. There was something else here besides just physical beauty because, I mean, he's surrounded by all these beautiful women. He's in charge of them, and she stands out. And it may have been what Rob said, that she is maybe more humble than these other beautiful women. And she is seeking out advice from him, and she uses his advice to her advantage later, which shows some wisdom. Certainly it shows humility here as well. So I think there must have been something besides just her beauty that attracted people to her. It is speculation, but I think it's well-founded. And then Gus talked about God's hand in all this. And everyone remembers this little-known fact about Esther, is God is not mentioned by name in this book. So in saying that, it's almost as if we're saying, well, God is maybe not influential, or God is not active, or God is not acknowledged. But that's really not the case. Because as we read the story, it's obvious that Mordecai is aware of God, and they're calling upon God for assistance in this, even though he's not named by name. And I want to point that out as we come to it. Okay, so Esther, she's made an ally in this harem culture. She gets her opportunity after the year is over to meet the king, based on his name again is Haggai. She uses his advice on how to conduct herself, what to take with her when she goes to meet the king. It goes well. And in the text, it sounds like it's almost immediate in verse 17 of chapter 2. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins. so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Okay, so again, the Bible account is not a novel. We don't have all the details. It just states, as a matter of fact, he chose her. We don't have a lot of background here, so we can speculate, but that's all we really can do. So it's hard to tell what the relationship was between the two at this point, or how it develops over time. But there's another official in the king's court named Haman. Haman doesn't like Mordecai. Why is that? Okay, Mom says that Mordecai won't bow down to Haman, and that's the source of conflict, right?
And they were also mortal enemies.
Who is mortal enemies?
The Amalekites, who was what? Haman. Haman was an Amalekite.
Oh, you know, Agag, right? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So there's a tie there with the Jews and Haman's people. And so, we speculate that may be part of this hatred, because it's not just personal between the two. Haman goes beyond Mordecai and his plot to get revenge. He wants to wipe out all the Jews living in Persia. So that doesn't seem like that would be easy to accomplish. And yet, when the king is your ally, Haman has the opportunity. And so he brings to the king his plan to exterminate these people. And what's the king's reaction? Here's my ring. You go take care of this and make it happen. Does that seem odd to you, that a king would have that attitude? Laverne's not surprised at all with that.
What?
You're not surprised by...
No. Because he presented it in such a way
Okay.
that these people appear to be the enemy of the king.
Okay. He bribed him. Okay. And the bribe, he's going to put how much? It's 10,000 talents into the treasury. I think the ratio of Persian talents to the talents that we associate with the Hebrews or the Jews, it's like 10 to 1. I mean, this is a lot more money than a talent would be for the Hebrews. This is an incredible amount of money he's going to put in the treasury. And so the speculation was that Haman's acknowledging that by killing off this many of the king's own people, it's going to cost him some money. There's going to be some tax revenue, different revenue. So he's going to try to make up for that by putting money in the treasury. It's kind of a weird situation. But it strikes me as odd that a king is willing to have a group of his own people, admittedly they're captives, but just wiped out, and seemingly to take very little interest in it. He just kind of lets Haman do what he wants. What kind of man was this king? Let's take a second to think about who Esther is now married to. What kind of person is this? Hot-tempered, based on what?
His reactions to certain things that's happened already look like passion.
Okay, so his relationship with Vashti demonstrated that he's not going to tolerate really.
And then later on, we see him with when he falls off to the lap of Esther, pleading for his life, because he quickly goes from happy jolly to a roaring lion.
Okay. Mood swings, perhaps. Raul, and then Eric. Drunk. It describes him as drunken in these banquets. Okay. Yeah, the time. Rash would be a good word, and it is hard to track the time passage in this story. But it seems like years are given early on, and years are given when Vashti was removed. But from the time that he takes Esther into the events of Haman's plot, it's hard to tell the time passage. Eric, and then Melanie.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, back in chapter 1, it says that this is the third year of his reign.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had the impression that he was still very young, somewhat immature.
Okay.
I don't think we have any indication of how old he was,
Right.
but perhaps his father died and he was maybe a very young man, maybe he was 20.
Okay.
And just had the impression he was
Young
he
and
might have the wisdom and maturity
yes.
he needed for this.
Okay, and Melanie.
He was just easily manipulated.
Seems like it.
He didn't make decisions for himself. He let other people do that.
Okay. Melanie points out he seems to be easily manipulated. Rob.
Where I think he'd be 40 years old.
40 years old. Okay.
I also have to remember that these events occurred between Ezra 6 and 7. So Ezra's in charge of the
Uh-huh.
127 prophecies. And so he knows that the Jews are lacking.
Right. So yeah, he is part of that rebuilding effort with the Jews, but he's also doesn't seem to be, when someone's mentioned this already, not very stable. We know historical context tells us that he's fighting the Greeks at this time, and he makes some people think crazy decisions in his battles with the Greeks, that he may not be really stable mentally, in addition to his emotional state. So this is not an easy marriage that Esther has won, in this contest. And we're not even sure she wanted to be in the contest based on the text. There's speculation, but it's hard to say that this is something she ever wanted to be part of. Mark?
You all bring up some excellent points. One thing that as you take a step back and look at the book of Esther, it is farcical in its presentation of everybody except Mordecai and Esther. Everybody else is an idiot. Everybody is presented in a very poor light except for the two of them, and maybe the person who helps Esther. But that's something to keep in mind. There's a lot of humor in this book.
But is it realistic? Is it
It's realistic, but it's also slanted toward showing this guy's just easily manipulated.
Okay.
Haman is manipulative
Mm-hmm.
and
Evil to the core, right?
And ultimately God is behind all of this.
Yes. Okay, so let's keep moving because I'm bogging myself down here in some of the details. We got some questions to answer. Let's see, where did we leave off in the story? So the plot, Haman wants to kill all the Jews. And this is where it gets to be part of the influence that Esther is going to need to demonstrate. Haman is essentially the chief of staff of all these princes to the king. Mordecai is also an official. Why doesn't Mordecai go to the king and address the problem directly? This is a speculation question.
I think greater people had access to the king like that.
Who had easy access to the king at this time? Really just Haman that we can tell. So when Mordecai realizes he doesn't have an easy avenue to the king, and perhaps decide he doesn't have enough influence to address this, he wants Esther to take that on. What is Esther's first response?
She's terrified. She knows what the penalty is. She's afraid.
Afraid? Penalty of death for what?
For approaching the king.
Okay.
Not being called.
Even her to approach the king without being summoned was a dangerous proposition, because she could come to the court, but if he didn't extend the scepter to her, she would be killed. And there's no guarantee that this guy was going to act rationally in this instance. And she says it's been how long that she's been summoned? I mean, it's been a while since she's even had access to him. And for her to go was something that to her was a dangerous proposition. So how does Mordecai respond famously to her concerns?
He tells her, he says, you don't know this could be the reason why you're the queen.
Right. And it brings us to Esther chapter 4 and verse 13. And I'll just read this just for review. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? What made Mordecai think that the Jews would be delivered? What possible guarantee would he have that was going to happen?
God had told them that they would be held captive for 70 years and they would return, so he obviously believed
Okay.
God had said.
Okay. So it doesn't mention God here, but it's a necessary inference that he's aware of the promises God has made to Abraham specifically, these prophecies possibly beyond that. So to me, I think this is a good verse to point out that while God may not be mentioned, Mordecai is a God-fearing man and is aware of these promises and is going to act in a way that demonstrates his faith in those promises.
I think it's very important to recognize the fact that Mordecai says, if you don't, the Jews will still be spared. I mean, that is crucial. And I think that speaks to the fact that he is aware of God.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so whenever we've been doing speculation through this whole study, and we've said numerous times, and we speculated what would have happened if this person hadn't acted or the influence wasn't there. We've always said God's will is going to be completed, and people are going to choose whether or not to be God's instruments, and that's something they'll have to answer for. But God is going to have his will completed. And in this case, God wasn't going to allow the Jews to be exterminated. And Mordecai, I think, is right here too. Who knows that you weren't put here for this exact purpose? And I think she was there for that exact purpose, and yet she still had an action she had to take. And she didn't know how it was going to play out. So she's being asked to do something dangerous, and yet she is the best suited to take this on. Comments on Mordecai and Esther at this point? Okay, so how does she respond to Mordecai's little nudge here?
She asked for fasting and prayer for 3 days
She asked for fasting and prayer.
from all the Jews.
Is that what yours says?
She told them to go and tell people to fast and pray on her behalf.
Okay.
But also that she would do it too.
Okay, so mine, I'll read you my verse 15 through 17. So Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. So mine just says fasting. It doesn't mention any prayers. Does anyone have any mention of prayer in the text?
The assumption is whenever the Jews fasted, it was to devote themselves.
Okay. So Julie is pointing out that the fasting is tied to the prayers. But could you say, well, perhaps she's fasting because she wants to look thin when she goes to see the king? Is that realistic? Okay. Okay, so I agree. She doesn't mention prayer, but the fasting does imply the prayer. And so I think it's interesting and important to note that Esther was willing to do this risky thing, and yet she wants some preparations done ahead of it. And are these appropriate preparations for this kind of discussion? Well, clearly, I mean, going to God in prayer and fasting is something that's going to make her attempt more likely to succeed. And it's not enough for her to fast and pray with her maidens, but she asked that Mordecai get who else? All the Jews in the capital. So does he have access to all the Jews? Seems like he does. Okay, so this is a part of the story that perhaps I've overlooked in the past. They're not just taking their best shot out on their own. They're going to God, and they're trying to get His blessings on this, which is kind of changes the story a bit. Yeah, Julie?
According to history, it was at this point when they were in Babylon that the synagogue was created for
Okay.
the Jews to do their study and praying together. And so if he was of any influence, all they would do was go to
The
the
synagogue.
synagogue and follow them.
Yeah, that's likely that they had a system in place by now to do that. But also Mordecai seems like a well-respected figure in the capital, and probably had some way otherwise also to reach out and get the Jews.
They didn't have email.
They didn't have email back then. No. So, okay. Did I miss any important elements of the story before we start discussing some of the influence here? Anybody want to correct or add anything? Obviously, there's a lot more to the story. We're just hitting some of the key elements, and then we'll go to our table now and try to answer these questions. And I'm focusing really, and I don't recall if I highlighted or underlined chapters 5 and 7, where she goes to the king. Tell you what, let's quickly summarize that real quick before we answer these questions, because we're going to run out of time here. So when she's ready, the 3 days are complete, the fasting, and she goes to the king. What is his response when he sees her? Yeah, he does. He receives her. Okay, that's the first hurdle is passed. He doesn't send her for execution. He lowers the scepter. She touches it. She comes in. He says, "I'll give you the kingdom, half the kingdom." Okay, so what does she ask for? She starts off right away. I need you to cancel this edict that's going to kill the Jews. Yeah, she invites him to a banquet and bring Haman. And so then they're at the banquet, and they're in the first course, which apparently is wine. And he says, "What is it that you want?" She says, "I want you to reverse the decree." She doesn't ask for that. What does she ask at that point? I want a banquet tomorrow. Just you and Haman. Why? Why is she beating around the bush? She's setting him up? Setting Haman up. Okay. You think she has in mind that she's going to kind of trap Haman in this instance?
I don't know if it's so much to trap Haman, it could have been, but also she was going to ask this thing in front of everybody.
Okay.
You know, it needed to be between the parties involved.
Okay. What would have happened if she had asked the king to reverse his edict in front of a large crowd? Is that a high probability of success? No, I wouldn't think so. He seems to be prideful enough where he would not want, perhaps, to admit that anything needed to be corrected. Rob? Wait, but she doesn't even know that yet. That's true. He didn't have the authority to reverse the edict, but she seems to be asking precisely for that later. And he has to explain, that's not how this works. She makes him comfortable.
She gets him comfortable, and that's the thing about the second day here, that's so much ease with this feasting, that it's easier for her to be able to make that request.
Is it possible that time with her during these banquets is reminding him of why he loved her in the first place? Is it possible that she's just being softening him up, being around him, rebuilding? If it's been a while since they've been together, just rebuilding some of that goodwill. Okay. She doesn't come in cold, is the point, and just ask for something big. She's easing into this. And I think there's some wisdom there, even though I don't perhaps understand exactly the reasons why. It seems that she's very deliberate with this. And it may have been that through her prayer and fasting, she determined this was going to be the best course. Okay, so we're not going to get into all the details, but uh, it works out just perfectly for her in that, yeah, Haman ends up being hung uh, on the yard arm, on the gallows that he built for Mordecai, and he built him 50 cubits high. Is that, we don't deal with cubits? Is that a normal height when you build a gallows? Very showy. It's like 70 feet, 75 feet in the air. Haman was so desirous to get Mordecai hung that he was going to do it in grand style. It was going to be a spectacle, the biggest hanging they'd ever seen, and it ended up being the way this plays out. The king is going to use that to hang Haman. Laverne?
Haman was so eaten up with hatred and wanting power that he didn't really consider the consequences himself.
Haman had a lot, and his family, his friends, his wife pointed out, you've got, access to the king, you've got all these sons, you have all this wealth, you're you know, you're well known, but none of that mattered to him. He was offended that Mordecai wouldn't bow down. Rob?
He cast lots too.
Yeah.
Some of these demonic spirits.
Right.
So this is to help God juxtaposition with darkness.
These false gods that he was relying on. Okay. All right. Okay, so now let's go to the sheet and answer some questions now that I've kind of finished the story for us. So what's the relationship with the influenced individual? Yeah, spouses, obviously husband and wife. Was this a long-term relationship or a short-term? Say a long-term, because they were married. How long? I couldn't find any kind of reference for how long he had been married to Esther when this played out. But so it is, I would say long-term. It's just hard to say how long. And this is, recall though, this is not a normal marriage, right? She had limitations on her access to her husband. He was a bit unstable. This was, I would call, a difficult marriage for her. So she may not, if it was long term, she may still not have had the same familiarity with her spouse that we would expect. Overall results of the influence, positive or negative? Yeah, clearly positive. We've seen some negatives, but this is a positive. And what was her method of influence? What would you say her method was? Humility, okay. Respect. Would it have worked would it have worked without that in this instance? Would he have tolerated anything besides humility? Yeah, that was just to get her in the door with humility and respect. So she had to have that because of who he was. What else should she use? Food. She certainly used food. Okay. What else?
Her beauty.
Beauty was part of it.
Because when she was there in the court, he saw her, and it reminded him of that, of his love.
Yes, she is where she is partly because of her beauty. What else?
She used her respect and belief in the Lord, and
Okay. Respect and belief in God and his people. Okay. See, I put prayer and fasting there as well as one of the methods she used. And what's interesting is she used every single tool available to her, and she needed it all. But she took her time and thought about this, she prayed about this, and planned this out, and she ended up using the food and the respect, the beauty, everything. And so she really worked at this to make sure she had a good chance for success. What was the impact of the influence? The Jews were saved. That's right, and that was what was needed here. Was it the result of a conscious effort? Absolutely. King Ahasuerus aware of the effort to influence? Yeah, she came to him with a request. He kept asking her what the request was, and she kept putting him off. But clearly, he's expecting to be influenced here. Would he have been better off or worse off without the influence?
Well, yeah, this is what else is going.
Mark?
Purchase suffering right now because of his poor leadership
Okay.
in the States.
Right.
That's in the backdrop. We
Yep.
don't have much detail. Destroying and annihilating the Jews would not have been a good thing.
No, yeah. Okay. So clearly there would have been some consequences. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Don't you think that Haman would have caused him to be even worse king?
Mhm. Yeah, Haman's influence was going to continue to make things worse for the king and for Persia. That's true. Okay. So speculation here, what would have been the results of the situation without Esther's influence? Well, we just said Haman's going to continue to be at the king's right hand with his bad advice. The Jews, what would have happened to the Jews without? Okay, yeah. So we're already told, Mordecai makes it clear, God's going to save the Jews somehow. But did Haman know that Esther was a Jew? Well, she didn't tell anybody, but was she secretive about this?
All he told her was to not tell her.
Did they know Mordecai was a Jew? Clearly, that they knew Mordecai was a Jew, and that's why he was a target for this new decree. And the relationship between Esther may have been initially secretive between Mordecai, but by the time we get to the story's development, there's officials going back and forth as messengers between Esther and Mordecai. Esther's servants are the ones that tell Esther, Mordecai is in the city gates in sackcloth and ashes, and he's weeping. This is very public, and all these people going back and forth as messengers. If all these servants in the palace knew that relationship, don't you think Haman knew the relationship as well?
Not necessarily.
You don't think so, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't say, but my speculation is that Haman knew that Esther was a Jew, and if Mark disagrees. Okay.
And Haman had his own sets of things that he had to do, and his consumption over just Mordecai himself, trying to get rid of him, and help continue to build himself up because of his own
Sure.
the way he saw himself. He didn't really pay attention to what else was going on in the house, especially over on that side.
He was obsessed.
He was.
Mordecai.
He was obsessed with
And
Mordecai.
by the way, you talk about the influence of women. Don't forget, if you're out of time, don't forget his wife. Haman's wife is the one who said to build the gallows.
Uh-huh.
And she indirectly killed her own husband and children.
Okay. So we are out of time. Let me see if there's anything else. A couple takeaways. Takeaways from this. Anyone have something they want to share?
I kind of think that the idea that Mordecai and Esther conversed through servants kept their relationship on down low.
Okay.
I mean, it may have been obvious to people closely involved, but to the kingdom on a bigger level.
Sure. Yeah. I'm sure the kingdom had no idea.
And
Yeah.
I don't think Haman
Okay.
Haman would have replayed him, risk it a lot if he thought that he was going to get killed in his church.
Okay. Rob.
Well, one thing, not only were the Jews protected, but Peter was blessed, and more had to do the same.
Yep. Absolutely.
Mordecai.
Yeah, Mordecai is going to rise up through this to higher levels even. Okay, a couple things on takeaways. Sometimes we're called upon to use our influence, and that may take, as Esther did, a little bit of planning, some prayer, some thought, and to use every tool we have available, depending on the situation. Prayer and fasting can't be ignored when we're talking about how influential we can be. And women sometimes are going to be in difficult relationships and still need to be able to do their best and maximize influence. So, okay, that's it. Thank you guys.